In 2009, the United States Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine began a research program with an unusual objective: not weapons, not equipment. They wanted to understand how a small number of indigenous hunters in the Amazon rainforest could navigate 40 kilometers of dense, unmarked jungle and arrive at their destination within minutes of their estimated time. With no compass, no map, and no training program that had ever come close to producing that result in a trained soldier, what they found after years of research was not a technique that could be taught in a classroom. It was something closer to a different way of perceiving the environment entirely. And the conclusion their research eventually reached was uncomfortable for an institution built around the idea that any skill can be trained if the program is good enough. The skill in question has a name among researchers who study it: ecological triangulation. It refers to the simultaneous, continuous reading of multiple environmental signals: wind direction, canopy density, water flow patterns, animal sound distribution, and subtle shifts in soil composition underfoot, processed not sequentially, but as a single integrated perception, the way an experienced musician hears an entire orchestral score rather than one instrument at a time. Western military survival training has spent decades trying to formalize navigation without modern equipment. The U.S. military's survival, evasion, resistance, and escape program, known throughout the armed forces as SERE training, includes land navigation components specifically designed to prepare personnel for scenarios in which GPS and standard equipment are unavailable. These programs are rigorous, well-funded, and have been refined over more than half a century of operational experience. They do not produce results comparable to what researchers documented among Amazon tribal hunters. The specific population that drew sustained research attention were Matsés hunters of the Javari Valley, along the border between Brazil and Peru, one of the most remote inhabited regions of the western Amazon. Field documentation conducted by anthropologists working alongside military researchers recorded multiple cases in which experienced Matsés hunters returned to their village from distances exceeding 40 kilometers through dense, visually uniform canopy, with no trail, no celestial navigation available due to canopy cover, and no electronic equipment of any kind, arriving consistently within minutes of the time they had estimated before departing. When researchers attempted to understand the mechanism behind this capability, what they documented was not a single trick or technique that could be extracted and taught. Before a Matsés hunter leaves the perimeter of the village, he performs an extended environmental assessment that linguist and anthropologist Harriet Minks, who spent 3 years documenting Matsés practices, described as the closest available translation to environmental diagnosis. The hunter reads the behavior of specific bird species whose call patterns shift when a large predator has recently moved through an area. He observes the directional movement of leafcutter ant columns, which change course in response to ground moisture conditions that precede flash flooding events. He checks the underside of specific broadleaf plants for fungal growth patterns that correlate with atmospheric pressure changes preceding violent storms. None of this is written down. None of it is formally taught through instruction in the way a classroom curriculum would teach it. It is transmitted through proximity, through thousands of hours of supervised exposure beginning in early childhood, long before a child could articulate what they were learning or why. The conclusion reached by researchers working with the U.S. Army Research Institute of Environmental Medicine after years of studying this capability was not what the institution had hoped to find. They had approached the research with the implicit assumption common to most modern training philosophy, that with sufficient analysis, any human capability can be decomposed into discrete, teachable components and transferred to a new learner through a sufficiently well-designed program. What the data suggested instead was a developmental window problem. The level of environmental integration demonstrated by experienced Matsés hunters appeared to depend on neurological pattern formation that begins in early childhood, when the brain's capacity for forming dense, automatic associative networks is at its highest. Researchers studying skill acquisition and critical periods in human neurological development have long documented that certain categories of perceptual and spatial learning show dramatically reduced plasticity once a person reaches adulthood. Language acquisition is the most widely known example, but spatial and environmental cognition appear to follow a similar pattern. According to research published in multiple peer-reviewed neuroscience journals examining critical periods in sensory and spatial processing development, this finding carried direct implications for military training doctrine. If the environmental awareness demonstrated by Amazon tribal hunters could only be acquired through a developmental process beginning in early childhood, then no training program applied to adult recruits, regardless of duration, regardless of resources invested, could realistically be expected to produce equivalent results. The skill was not primarily a matter of information. It was a matter of when in a person's neurological development that information was first encountered and integrated. This is not to say the research produced no practical applications. Elements of the environmental reading techniques documented among Amazon tribes were incorporated into expanded SERE curriculum components addressing tropical and jungle survival environments specifically. Improved instruction on reading animal behavior as an environmental indicator, more detailed botanical identification training, and modified approaches to teaching spatial awareness that, while not replicating the full integrated perception observed in tribal hunters, did measurably improve trainee performance in jungle navigation exercises compared to previous curriculum versions. But the gap between trained adult performance and the capability observed in hunters who had been developing these skills since early childhood remained substantial throughout the research period. Military researchers documented this gap not as a failure of training methodology, but as a genuine limitation rooted in human developmental neuroscience. The same category of limitation that explains why adults who learn a second language after puberty typically retain a detectable accent regardless of fluency, while children who acquire multiple languages simultaneously in early childhood develop native-level competency in all of them. The parallel is not incidental. Both phenomena appear to reflect the same underlying principle. Certain categories of complex pattern recognition become progressively less plastic as the brain matures, making early exposure not simply advantageous, but, in practical terms, close to a requirement for achieving the highest levels of performance. The military's interest in Amazon tribal survival knowledge extended beyond navigation into a second area that received less public attention but arguably carried more direct tactical relevance: water assessment and treatment in tropical environments without modern purification equipment. Standard military field doctrine for water purification relies on equipment: purification tablets, filtration systems, boiling when fuel and time permit. These methods are effective when the equipment is available and functioning. They offer no solution when equipment fails, is lost, or was never carried due to mission constraints. Researchers studying indigenous water assessment practices in the Amazon documented something military doctrine had no equivalent for: the ability to assess, through direct observation alone, which water sources in a given environment carried acceptable risk and which did not, without any equipment at all. The Kayapo people of the Xingu River Basin, studied extensively by Brazilian researchers, including a team from the University of São Paulo, whose 2014 analysis was later referenced in broader research on indigenous water treatment methods, use a combination of crushed seeds from the copaiba tree and the inner bark of the kumaru tree to treat water from sources they assess as borderline. Laboratory analysis of this treatment method found it reduced bacterial load in test samples by margins comparable to basic commercial filtration tablets, a finding that surprised researchers who had not expected a plant-based field treatment to perform competitively against manufactured purification technology. More significant than the treatment method itself was the assessment process that preceded it, the specific knowledge of which water sources required treatment, which were safe without intervention, and which should be avoided entirely regardless of treatment, based on seasonal patterns, the presence of specific aquatic plant and animal indicators, and characteristics of water color, flow rate, and surrounding vegetation that experienced community members could read with a reliability that took outside researchers considerable time to verify, let alone replicate. This assessment capability is precisely the kind of skill that has direct relevance to military operations conducted in environments where standard equipment may be unavailable, damaged, or insufficient. Extended special operations missions, survival scenarios following equipment loss, and operations in environments where carrying sufficient purification supplies for extended deployment is not logistically feasible. Research documentation from this period notes that several elements of indigenous water assessment knowledge were evaluated for potential incorporation into survival training materials, though the same developmental window limitation that constrained navigation training applied here as well. The pattern recognition involved in rapid water source assessment relied on the same kind of dense, intuitive, early acquired perceptual learning that resisted compression into a short-term adult training curriculum. What emerged from this body of research, across both the navigation studies and the water assessment studies, was a consistent and somewhat uncomfortable conclusion for an institution whose entire operational philosophy is built around the premise that sufficiently rigorous training can produce any required capability. Some forms of knowledge, the research suggested, are not primarily informational. They are developmental. They require not better instruction, but a different kind of childhood. The broader significance of this research extends well beyond its direct military applications into a question that touches anthropology, neuroscience, and the fundamental assumptions Western institutions make about the relationship between formal education and genuine expertise. For most of the 20th century, indigenous environmental knowledge was treated, even within serious academic anthropology, as a category of folklore, interesting as cultural documentation, but not taken seriously as a body of functional expertise comparable to formally trained Western technical knowledge. The research conducted in collaboration with military institutions, precisely because it approached the question from a position of practical operational interest rather than cultural curiosity, produced a different kind of evidence. It demonstrated, through rigorous comparative testing against trained military personnel, that the capability gap was real, measurable, and not explainable through any deficiency in the training methodology applied to the military comparison group. This matters because it inverts a long-standing and largely unexamined assumption. The assumption has generally been that formal training, backed by institutional resources, scientific methodology, and structured curriculum design, represents the most efficient path to expertise in any domain. The Amazon navigation and water assessment research suggested something more specific and more limited. Formal training is extraordinarily effective for knowledge that can be acquired at any point in a person's life. It appears to hit a hard ceiling when the knowledge in question depends on neurological windows that close in childhood. This is not a finding that diminishes the value of military training programs. SERE training and related survival curriculum remain rigorous, evidence-based, and effective at producing trained personnel capable of surviving in environments without standard equipment, including jungle environments. What the research clarified is the specific ceiling on that effectiveness, and the reason that ceiling exists is not a failure of program design. It is a fact about human neurological development that no amount of additional funding or training hours can fully overcome. For the Matsés, the Kayapo, and other Amazon tribal communities whose knowledge became the subject of this research, none of this was new information. They had never framed their environmental knowledge as a teachable curriculum in the Western sense, because their entire model of knowledge transmission already assumed what the research eventually confirmed, that this kind of understanding is built through childhood immersion, not adult instruction. Children begin accompanying experienced hunters and gatherers as soon as they are physically able, observing and absorbing patterns years before they are expected to demonstrate independent competency. The system was never designed as a short course. It was designed as a lifetime. What the research ultimately documented, stripped of its military framing, was a confirmation of something anthropologists had argued for decades without the kind of rigorous comparative data that institutional research could provide, that the knowledge systems developed by Amazon tribes represent a form of expertise as legitimate, as rigorous, and in several specific domains as functionally superior to anything Western institutional training has been able to produce. Not because the people who hold it are inherently different, but because the conditions under which they acquired it cannot be replicated within the compressed time frame of adult education. The skill was never secret in the sense of being deliberately hidden. It was simply never transferable in the way modern institutions assumed all valuable knowledge eventually must be. And that distinction between knowledge that can be taught and knowledge that can only be grown is the conclusion the research kept arriving at year after year, regardless of how the question was approached or how much institutional resource was applied to solving it. Some forms of mastery cannot be issued. They can only be raised.